Our next speaker this morning is Gillian Davies. She's the senior wetland scientist with the BSC group, and she's here to speak to us this morning about the importance of wetlands in carbon sequestration and in the carbon cycle. So, Gillian, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about wetlands and how they're impacted by climate change, how they function in the global carbon cycle, and the climate adaptation services they offer. Okay, thank you. How's this? Is this better? Okay. Yeah, okay. Is that all right? Okay, great. So wetlands occupy a relatively small percentage of the landscape, but they are disproportionate storage areas for soil carbon, and under the right circumstances can be significant carbon sequestration engines. In addition to that, they offer climate adaptation services to the ecosystem and to the human communities around them. Okay. This one? Okay. I'm not going to spend time talking about basic climate change information, but have some references for anyone who would like that sort of thing at the end. As you may know, carbon is one of the elements that cycles on the planet from what we refer to as sinks or banks. The major sinks and banks on the planet are the oceans, the soil, the Earth's deposits, plants, and the atmosphere. And the amount of carbon in each of these banks or sinks depends on the annual rate of exchange between the various banks and sinks. This graphic gives some indication of the relative proportions of the different banks and sinks, which are shown in blue, and annual exchange rates. The units, the pools or the banks are in petograms, which is 10 to the 15th grams of carbon. So those are very large numbers. And a gigaton. And then the fluxes are in petograms per year. So as an example, we can look at the ocean. Annually, the ocean gives off some carbon to the atmosphere, about 90 petograms a year, but it takes up 92. So there's a net transfer from the atmosphere to the ocean. And those types of cycles are happening through these different things. Fossil fuels are stores of carbon from ancient ecosystems. And this is a Carboniferous period swamp, where the Carboniferous period was a period of substantial carbon sequestration on the planet millions and millions of years ago. Most of that carbon sequestration happened in wetlands. Without wetlands, we would not likely have had the Industrial Revolution. Likewise, without wetlands, we might not be faced with the climate change problems we're looking at now. And that points to the idea that wetlands can be an integral part of how we respond to climate change and how we're further being impacted by climate change. Biological carbon sequestration happens in many locations on the landscape. Places where good rates of carbon sequestration tend to happen are lake bed sediments, wetlands, estuarine environments, oceans, also in forests where carbon gets sequestered into the biomass. And then there are other locations on the landscape where there's a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere. Those tend to be agricultural areas and disturbed soils where the soil is exposed to the atmosphere and carbon is oxidizing off into the atmosphere. Many of those places where carbon sequestration occurs at a relatively accelerated rate are areas where the soil is saturated or flooded, and there's an anaerobic environment. The anaerobic environment changes the soil microbial community and the soil processes. And that's what allows the carbon to stay in the soil. And in an upland forest, at a certain point, the soil processes get into equilibrium and you don't develop as deep organic layers as you do, say, think about a peatland or a salt marsh that can have tens and tens of feet of depth. And these are some numbers from some different studies that just gives you an idea of the significance of wetlands. Although they only occupy a very small percentage of global land surface, they store approximately 30% of the world's soil carbon. On the other hand, they're responsible for anywhere from 20 to 40% of the global methane emissions per year, according to the IPCC. Different studies are going to have slightly different numbers here, but the main thing to take away is the proportionality of wetlands. These are some numbers from different studies showing how many billions of tons of soil carbon are stored in wetlands around the globe, 300 to 700 billion. Most of the soil carbon in North America is stored in Canadian peatlands. These peatlands tend to sequester carbon at a rate of 29 teragrams of carbon per year. Some other rates of carbon sequestration in wetland soils, 60 teragrams per year from mineral soil wetlands. Another study showed boreal peatlands at 36 teragrams. So different studies, again, are going to have slightly different amounts. A teragram is 1 trillion grams. A million tons. Thanks. Yeah. So there's this question that can come up sometimes in wetlands discussions about whether wetlands sequester more carbon or whether they emit more carbon, because they sequester carbon dioxide and carbon, and they emit methane and nitrous oxide, both of which are greenhouse gases. Turns out that saltwater and estuarine wetlands are very efficient carbon sequesters, and they emit relatively low rates of methane because they have a sulfur-based microbial chemical process. Older freshwater wetlands, i.e. undisturbed freshwater wetlands, are net carbon sequesterers. They've had enough time to develop that capacity. Again, forested wetlands store a lot of carbon in their tree biomass. The place that gets a little tricky is with created or restored wetlands or disturbed wetlands. In those younger systems, there can be an initial period where the wetland can actually emit more methane than it's sequestering the carbon, but every single wetland will eventually get to what they call a switchover time, where it then switches over and becomes a net carbon sequesterer. And the question is, how long does that take? And there are a variety of estimates on that, from tens of years to thousands of years. If we were looking at wetland restoration and wetland creation through the lens of how do we maximize carbon sequestration, we would want to focus on saltwater or estuarine wetland environments, with the understanding, though, that some of those may be vulnerable to sea level rise and may not be around for that long. We could focus on forested inland wetlands. Also, there's some work showing that in situations where a freshwater wetland has a fluctuating water table, that can limit the methane emissions issue. And we can also identify best management practices during the actual wetland construction process that can maximize carbon sequestration and minimize the methane emissions, such as preserving the soil structure. So it all comes back to the soils. How are wetlands being impacted by climate change? Wetlands are a transitional type of ecosystem. They're not as dry as the uplands, and they're not as wet as the aquatic systems, which means that they can be very sensitive to slight changes in the water table. And as our hydrologic system changes, due to changes in precipitation, more drought, those slight shifts in the water table can have a big impact on wetlands. The other thing to be aware of is that they are already stressed by invasive species, land use change, landscape fragmentation, so their capacity to be resilient has already been compromised by other things. Some of the ways that a changing hydrologic regime will impact wetlands is that we're seeing increases in precipitation and severe storm events in the late winter and the spring, meaning that we're going to need more area on our landscape that will function as a wetland to provide flood storage. People talk about wetlands being a sponge on the landscape. That's a very good analogy. So when we have heavy precipitation, the wetland sponge can absorb the water and prevent those floodwaters from flooding nearby areas. We're also going to see more drought, more high heat days during the dry ends of the year and during particularly bad years. In those cases, we will see wetlands, the functional area of a wetland, shrinking down to much smaller than it was. So we're going to put the two of them together, we're going to have a zone of fluctuation with the wetland that's larger than what we used to have. And we need to think about that in terms of how we regulate and manage wetlands. These impacts will have impacts on our water quality as well. Neither extreme is good for water quality. During high flood times, those floodwaters are going to go higher in the landscape and pick up toxins and bring those into the wetland. And during low flow times, the flow will concentrate toxins. Ecosystem processes will change. There'll be accelerated decomposition, photosynthesis, and plant growth when there's more precipitation, and deceleration of those things when there's drought and less precipitation. We'll see changes in snowpack, and the ice out will tend to occur earlier, so timing of spring events will change. These will all have impacts on fish and wildlife habitat and will lead to changes in our groundwater systems, which then can affect the function of wetlands. As we all know, as we have all been experiencing over the last few weeks with these heavy snowstorms, we're seeing more acute events. Acute events can lead to longer lasting changes. They can cause a shift in an ecosystem. They can knock out particularly vulnerable species. So even though the event is over, there can be longer term impacts. And some of those acute events are listed up here. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on a little bit faster. We're also going to see increases in CO2 in the atmosphere that can lead to greater productivity of plants unless something else is limiting their productivity. The denser vegetation can actually help water quality. We'll see increases in temperature, which also accelerates photosynthesis, decomposition, soil respiration, and the length of the growing season. These temperature increases, though, can exacerbate existing ecosystem stresses such as invasive species, pollution, and land use change. Increased temperature can cause larger ecosystem changes such as dissociation of predators and prey and phenologically related species. Phenology refers to the timing of life cycle events, such as the warmer weather could trigger earlier flowering of plants, but the pollinators who might be migrating up from the south will be keying into the daylight changes, and then they'll get disassociated. That can lead to ecosystem-wide disassembly. And we'll see more southern species coming up, and more vulnerable species will drop out earlier. In coastal areas, the low marsh will be flooded out and will become open water. Low marsh will try to migrate up gradient and displace the high marsh. Where the land surface is natural and has a low gradient, that high marsh will be able to migrate up gradient. However, if we have development right behind existing salt marsh, or a natural steep grade in the land, that high marsh will die out. It won't be able to migrate back up. So that's a vulnerability. Water tables in the coastal area will become more saline, and we have land subsidence exacerbating those impacts, and structural processes will be impacted. This can lead to what ecologists call distress syndrome, where there's a conglomerate of negative impacts to biodiversity, nutrient cycling, increases in disease and invaders. So that's a lot of bad news, but there are some things that we can do, such as looking for ways to accelerate carbon sequestration into soils, decelerating carbon emissions, and protecting large carbon banks. Large carbon banks on the planet tend to be wetlands. We can try to protect water tables so that those permanently flooded wetlands don't lose their soil carbon. And we need to increase the buffer zones around wetland resources so that they can migrate up and up the landscape when they need to, and look for ways to maximize connectivity between systems so species can migrate, particularly along north-south corridors. And we want to protect those large undisturbed ecosystems. We can start to include climate change modeling in our management, restoration, and creation of wetlands, and look for ways to minimize other stressors. And think about how we manage, restore, and create wetlands on a landscape or watershed scale. And this group is particularly involved with restorative development, with the idea of restorative development, and that can be applied, I think, in the world of managing and regulating wetlands and other resources by looking at how to maintain biodiversity and mimicking the natural ecosystem services while taking into consideration human needs. Some high carbon wetlands to be aware of, peatlands, where are largely the northern and tropical peatlands are the most significant. They represent 1/3 of the global wetland resource and 30% of the global soil carbon. Again, different studies have slightly different numbers. And then temperate permanently flooded wetlands can have a lot of soil carbon, as can coastal wetlands. We in the temperate zone, I think, don't fully appreciate how significant the northern peatlands are on the landscape. They can represent up to 70% of the landscape in Canada. And boreal forest is 30% of the global forested area. This is very significant. This is a picture of some Siberian wetlands showing you just how dominating they are in that type of landscape. And unfortunately, there's an oil rig there, which suggests their vulnerability to a leak. With that much water on the landscape, any kind of accident there is devastating. These are some tropical peatlands. Two of the pictures are healthy, naturally functioning tropical swamplands. The one on the lower left is showing what's happening in much of Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia, where logging and conversion of these peatlands to palm oil plantations is occurring at a tremendous rate. And the upper right one shows fires burning, which is happening a lot, just taking that carbon that's in the biomass and in the soil and converting it to carbon in the atmosphere. Peatland degradation causes an average of 2 to 3 billion tons of carbon emissions per year, most of that in Southeast Asia. And in the Everglades, soil subsidence is observed at 2 centimeters per year, which is associated with a carbon loss of 2,400 grams of carbon per square meter, so large losses. And as we mentioned, coastal wetlands release methane at lower rates. Estuarine wetlands contribute about 31% of the net wetland carbon sequestration in the continental US, so they're significant. These are some interesting sequestration versus emission numbers showing how significant wetlands are compared to upland forest, and then some unfortunate emission numbers. Just putting it all in perspective. Since this group may have a particular interest in agriculture, I added this slide in just showing some of the vulnerabilities in agricultural landscapes that the drainage, tillage, and traditional grazing can accelerate the experienced climate change impacts by reducing water infiltration, runoff, pollution loading, and so can experience greater flooding and decreased water quality. Integrating wetlands into your agricultural landscape can help offset this. They offer climate adaptation services in that regard. Cranberry bog wetlands, which the Southeast Mass is known for, are going to have trouble due to losing cooler nights in the fall and having warmer springs, more pests and funguses, and more costs associated with those impacts. Wetlands help the larger ecosystem and our human systems to adapt to climate change, where wetlands are peatlands and wetlands and lakes are small percentages of the watershed. They can significantly increase the capacity for flood storage, preventing storm damage, greater water quality, wildlife habitat, preserving water supplies. All of those things are positively influenced by having even small amounts of wetland in your watershed. Wetlands also, they can help offset that loss of snowpack and the increases in drought, as we've mentioned. They also function as air conditioners on the landscape, helping to keep the surrounding areas cooler. I have to zip along here. One of the things that I want to leave you with is the idea that wetlands offer us a 3-for-1 deal. They give us those traditional ecosystem services that we've been talking about for decades, as well as climate adaptation and resiliency services, and they provide carbon sequestration. And because they offer ecosystem services, they prevent us from generating more carbon emissions, such as by building another water quality treatment plant when instead we could have wetlands or more, that sort of thing. And some ideas to ponder. We're going to see acceleration of invasive species, ecosystem disassembly, and I just want to end with a couple things. I just want to, if you're interested in wetlands and climate change, the Society of Wetland Scientists is having their international meeting from May 31st to June 4th this year in Providence, Rhode Island. It's going to be 5 days of focusing on wetlands and climate change with leading researchers from around the world presenting the latest knowledge on wetlands and climate change. So there's a website that you can go to for registration information, and I urge you all to go to that. And you can also Google Society of Wetland Scientists, and that'll take you to the website. And one parting thought. So, okay.